Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Crime Centric. This being a show I talk about crime dramas that I watch. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the series premiere of Landscapers. A great series premiere. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. First and foremost, this is a really peculiar series. It's a weird, awkward. I even looked at some places is referring to the show as a comedy, because looking at the trailer I was like, this show seems a little quirky, and it's like, no, that is by design. This is apparently based on a true story, but the way they spin it to be like, this is a story that is just like, yeah, it's just like a very fictionalized version while using some truth while also spinning things to be what you want, I guess, what you want to tell an entertaining and interesting story. Because it seems like this is one of those things, a fact is stranger than fiction. We'll get to it soon enough, but I had talked about this when we originally watched the trailer for it. I'm like, it's so fascinating that this, like, if you didn't have the context of like, oh, they were on the lam because they murdered someone, I didn't even realize, because the trailers didn't hint to this, so I thought that was an interesting development of like, oh, it's Susan's parents that are dead and buried in the backyard. That's interesting. I wasn't expecting, I was like, was it just some random people? I wouldn't have, expected her parents, but essentially, they're living somewhere in France, and Christopher is trying to get, like, a job, and it didn't go well. Because I love that, like, I don't think they didn't bother subtitling it, but, like, he was going in for a job, and it was, like, and I guess they've been here for a while, but he just never, like, fully learned French. So it's just in French, he's basically asking, like, oh, can you repeat the question? Please? And, job interview did not go super well, because he's sitting there kind of nodding and smiling a little bit like, could you repeat the question? Because I kind of didn't hear you. I'm like, I was like, this show is so weird, because at the same time that's all happening, like, beforehand, Susan got a poster. I'm like, we find out she's obsessed with, like, either this very specific movie or the lead of the movie, which is interesting. Because they don't have a lot of money. They don't even have enough money to pay their rent. But she's like, no, everything's going to work out. They got $100 from a new dude, Gerard, which I'm like, is that supposed to be like a movie star? Is that supposed to be so insignificant to them? Like, they never really went to it. It's just like, oh, we got a letter from Gerard, which Christopher reads later on. He's like, oh, I guess he's a movie star. I don't know if that's supposed to be the guy, because the movie poster she paid like $170 for it, and she lied to Christopher. It's like, oh yeah, like 20 euros. But also, like, we see that she has like a whole bunch of, like I said, like pictures and stuff based around like the lead of that show, like the lead of that movie. And I don't know if it's just the lead specifically. I don't know if it's like his role specifically in that movie, like what her obsession is with this very movie. I'm not a cinephile. Like, I don't know movies like that, especially classics. So, like, I don't know the significance. I'd have to look into, like, what the movie's really about and, like, how that, but, like, them using that specifically for storytelling purposes, there has to be, like, a parallel to be drawn. Like, I paid attention to a little bit, but I just let a lot of that slip because I was just too focused on just, like, the weird and awkward situation that Chris and Susan are going through. But, well, they were having money issues, and Chris ends up calling his stepmom Tabitha, and he's like, right, well, I'm about to tell you, you can't go to the police. I'm like, what the hell are you saying? And she contacted police about, like, my stepson called me about a body buried in the backyard. And I love that he's like, Chris is talking to Susan later on, he's like, I'm just as disappointed at you. In fact, he's like, no, in fact, I'm disgusted by the fact that she turned us in. I told her explicitly not to go to police. I'm like, what is this conversation? But even then, it's like, because even Susan's like, why'd you have to tell her? He was like, we needed money, and she wasn't going to give me any money, wouldn't allow me to borrow money. Because at first, the awkwardness of the conversation, you're like, right, it's the hard thing of, like, asking to borrow money. But the fact is that why couldn't you lie? That's the thing of, like, couldn't you found different circumstances to, like, lie about? Because I guess, like, no one knew where they were in the entire time. It's just like, oh, they just left, and that's just it. And no one ever got a straight answer about it, because I guess they stopped contacting anyone from their own life, I guess, in particular, people from his life. But it's like, why'd you have to tell her the truth? But it's like, yeah, I expressly told her not to tell the police, because for Susan, it's like, it's not just you, we're in this together. Because he had brought it up, like, oh, like, we could get money from Tabitha, we would just have to tell her the truth. And Susan's like, no. And he's like, oh, but she's like, no, we can't, don't be silly. He's like, right, you're right, it's silly. It's like, yeah, too late. By that time, he'd already had the conversation with Tabitha. Which I love that, like, Lacing brings this to Collier, and it's like, wait, what? Even he's, like, baffled by the situation. And so we have the whole situation of Lacing and Wilkie going to visit. Which, the actress who plays Lacing, I feel like I've seen her. I think I know where the actor who plays Wilkie, like, where I recognize him from. I believe that's William from Another Life on Netflix. I believe that's the same actor. But I love the whole thing of like, oh yeah, we arrived here, and it's like, no, that's 5, that's not 7, that's 7. The house that looks exactly the same. And it's like, oh, all right. And then they talk to the guy, and it's just like, oh. And then we got the neighbor who talks over the hedges. It's like, oh yeah, let's go to the part where like it breaks apart where we could talk, and it's like a little like spot in the bushes that you can talk through. And at the same time, the guy that's currently living there and the neighbor just kind of almost having a somewhat casual conversation. It's like, oh, do you want any... Is that what they call... Was that bangers? Is that burgers? Once again, it's just like, I'm not used to a lot of British terminology. So I was like... But I love that Wilkie's like enjoying it, and Lacey's just kind of like, no, I don't want any. But Wilkie's like, man, these are actually really good. So they're having conversations about Susan's parents. It's like, oh yeah, like the neighbors being like, oh, we didn't really know them that well. I mean, kind of, we heard like, basically, essentially it sounds like there were a lot of arguments that you heard. But other than that, it's like, oh, when they did, it's like, oh, I guess I figured I should mention, like, whenever you did see them walk out, like, she would always walk 2 or 3 yards behind him. And it's just like, yeah, and the guy's like, I don't know if that's some kind of clue. And then his wife leans in, like, whispers to him. He's like, oh, right. I should probably also mention, at one point in time, we saw Christopher digging a hole. Yeah, we were joking, like, haha, he must be burying the in-laws. And then it kind of goes from, like, a smile and kind of joking, ha ha ha, until, like, a serious face of, I don't know if that's some kind of clue. And I'm like, that has to be like a storytelling thing that they're doing, because they do this weird, like, they just how they structure this show is so interesting, because they do stuff where it's like, with the email situation we'll get to soon enough, it's like rather than just focus on like the typing of the email or whatever, we see that person just randomly standing there being like, oh yes, like verbally like saying the lines from the email and stuff like that. But also, like, moments like that, I'm like, I think that's them adding the levity of it, making it seem like, oh, it's weird and awkward. Like, now, whether that's a real conversation that was had in connection to this case, like, the neighbors were like, oh, yeah, like, we joked about them must be burying the in-laws' bodies. But it's like, yeah, like, it's just to show, like, being very, like, cheeky about it, I think. Not unless those are like verbatim conversations, which I doubt they are. I'm sure this show's taking a lot of liberties with a lot of the ins and outs. The gist of it's going to be what happened in real life, but the other aspects are just going to be them, like, constructing their own narrative. Because, like, him telling his in-law doesn't seem like that, at least based on what we saw at the very end, where they kind of show you the real life comparison, that it's like, it doesn't seem like that was, doesn't seem like the stepmother was kind of referenced at any point in time. Not unless that's something that comes up later on as we develop more and more into the case. But at the very least, they just kind of made it seem like, oh, it was an anonymous tip. So that's why I'm curious, was it the stepmom? We'll have to wait and find out. Or whether that was just something of like, they did tell someone and that's how it happened. Because we ended up finding out, like, oh, this wasn't just some casual accidental murder. I mean, I was like, oh, did you push him down the steps or something like that? It's like, no, they were both shot twice. I'm like, that's some hardcore. That's not like an accident. That's like, I mean, how do you like accidentally shoot 2 people twice each? Like, how do you do that? So that doesn't seem like an accident. It seems like they're setting up the fact that Susan had a very contentious relationship with her parents because they were probably verbally and maybe physically abusive, and she just finally snapped one day. It's because it seems like Chris was the one who was burying the bodies and stuff like that. But based on what the neighbors was also saying, like Chris and Susan are the ones who created the narrative of like, oh yeah, they moved somewhere a couple years before they actually started selling the place. It's like Christopher would be the main one to kind of come back and take care of things. I think Tabitha gave them Christopher's email, and then like Collier's emailing him, and it's just like, and then he emails back like, Chris is like, oh, my wife is fragile, so I want to we will come back when the time is appropriate, type of thing of like, wait, what is happening? And apparently, I mean, once again, they're probably taking liberties even with the emails to some extent, but the emails in general did happen. I'm like, wait, what? It's like, oh, they confessed to stuff because, as it says at the end, they ran out of money. So I'm like, the show is taking its liberties because it is the most absurd circumstances. It's like, once again, truth is stranger than fiction type of situation of like, so Christopher actually legitimately emailed the cops about the circumstances about turning themselves in, and you're like, wow. Because he suggests, like, no, we should turn ourselves in, because the more we run, the more guilty we look. And I look, because obviously, like, Susan was kind of, like, frustrated, was kind of breaking stuff, because she was like, right, we got to pack, I guess we're just going to have to move again. And he's just like, right, I'm sorry. It's like, do you want to watch a film? And she just kind of nods her head. I'm like, he mentioned his wife being, like, fragile and stuff like that, which I love. Lacing was kind of thinking, like, what kind of psychopath, like, emails about, like, I know, like, because she's thinking, like, oh, we're dealing with some sick puppies here. Like, the fact is that there must be some disturbing, like, crazy psychopath or something like that, and it's like, oh, what does he mean by, like, my wife is fragile? And she says a line that I was like, oh, that's a little too specific. She's like, oh, I know what fragile fucking means. And basically it's like, oh, that you're in charge and stuff like that. And it's like, it sounded like she was pulling from her own circumstances. It seems like she was kind of projecting her own situation into this. Wilkie did mention, like, when it comes to a good relationship, he was like, his mom brought up the fact is like, oh, you're either the gardener or you're the garden. And I'm like, I've heard that recently in something, and I don't remember what it was. It was definitely a TV show I watched fairly recently, but I don't remember what it was. I'm gonna have to look into it, but there was something that used that same metaphor about a relationship. You're either the gardener or or at the very least a variation of that very, like, metaphor. Which even Wilkie, because Lacing's like, oh, what does that mean? He's like, I don't know, I fucking hate gardening. I have no idea what it means. I mean, the gist of it's supposed to be like, either you're the person that does all the nurturing and support, like a gardener taking care of a plant, or you're a person that kind of takes all that and kind of, I'm butchering the metaphor, like because you can either be the person that takes care of someone in a relationship, or you can kind of be the one that's taken care of. That's me super oversimplifying it, and some of the nuance to it is lost in that oversimplification. But I think that's the gist of what that's supposed to kind of represent, metaphorically speaking. But I love that wasn't just a few, like one or two emails. It was like a little bit of a back and forth because with the emails, because Christopher ended up emailing Collier back of like, don't worry, we're going to turn ourselves in. We're going to take this particular, like, train to get there. The thing is, we don't have enough funds. So if you could buy the tickets for us, so it's like you're asking the cops to buy and pay for your tickets for you so that they can arrest you when you roll up. And it's like, yeah, this is what's going to happen. And I love that when they do get on the train and everything, it just seems like, oh, we're going on a little bit of a venture, it's just like, oh, how much money you got? It's like, oh, I only got this much. It's like, okay, might as well spend it. She's like, oh, I think I ran into Gerard. It's like, it couldn't have been him. Nah, probably just someone that looks alike. You would not think that they were under the circumstances of, oh, we're on this train to go turn ourselves in for a 15-year-old murder. I'm like, the absurdity of it, I can't stress that enough. But it is that thing of, like, reality does strike them, eventually, because, like, she was, Susan had drifted off and was sleeping, which I'm like, once again, sleeping under these circumstances is wild. But when she wakes up, she sees Christopher crying, and she's like, oh, I'm sorry, like, because because they had a conversation when they were actually having dinner. It's like, oh, has Collier like responded to your emails? He's like, oh, not yet, and stuff like that. But do your messages, and she's like, I'm sorry I ruined your life. He was like, no, you didn't ruin my life. You are my life. You know, it's going to be okay, sweetheart. I'm never going to leave you. And I'm like, and then it transitions to this black and white, like very like old school, like the things they do with like the cinematography of it. It's kind of really neat. But I was like I said, it's like if you didn't have the context of it being a murder, I think even with the context of this being related to a murder, there's still something sweet about like this love between Christopher and Susan. There's something really like actually endearing and sweet about it. Like this could be a sweet story all on its own. I like, oh yeah, this couple's struggling, but oh man, do they find themselves in an awkward situation when Christopher's stepmother turned them in for Susan's parents getting murdered, and they buried the bodies in the backyard 15 years ago, and they went on with their lives in France like it was nothing. Once again, we don't know, like, were they in France the entire 15 years, or was it just a thing of, hey, we eventually moved to France at some point in time in those 15 years. Well, it had to be a situation because, like, eventually Christopher and would come back to check on a place from time to time and then eventually selling it. So it had to be, like, sometime later before they ended up... Because the current resident moved in, like, 8 years ago. But I'm sure a lot of that could be handled, like, even when they're not in the country. Because Susan, interestingly enough, Susan and Christopher had to turn themselves in because there was not enough to really, at least the show saying this. I don't know if this applies in I'm not fully versed in European law, but basically getting like extradition from like France. Basically you would need like the who, the why, and the what, like the whole thing of like, we found bodies that were buried, but we don't know when they were buried. We know what happened to them, they were shot, but it's like, there's not enough tying it directly to these people enough to bring them in. So because even Lacing is like, oh, so you're saying that they could basically stay in France the entire time and just never worry about it? It's like, yeah, that's how this whole thing works. I love... Collier, just a weird character too, because he's like, earlier burns his mouth, and she's like, but yeah, but it's like, she's basically like, it's a flask, so of course it's going to be like hot because it's going to keep the heat or whatever. He's like, yeah, but I'm just burning my fucking mouth. Then he's just like so upset. He's like, oh, go get a fucking sandwich, later on. But like I said, Christopher and Susan, just like them being like, she's like, I just don't want to be away from you. He's like, we'll never be away from each other. Like, nothing's going to separate. We're always going to be together. So, and as they're walking, it's like, all right, so where did they say they're going to meet us? And they literally walk by Wilkie because, like, they brought out all the guards. Like, I'm like, you swear you're dealing with, like, mass murderers here. But the fact is that, but I don't know if that'd be the typical situation. Because basically we saw the real footage and, like, that might just be, like, a, like, European thing of, like, yeah, that's just the normal, like, mounted police officers and stuff like that. It seems so excessive for this type of situation, but it's like, I don't know whether they really believe that they were dealing with hardened criminals. Because even to the point, like I said, they walked past Wilkie because he didn't even realize they were that was them. And then Lacing was like, I think I see him, sir. It's like, Collier's like, what are they doing? It's like, they're just walking, sir. And it's like, all right, so what's going to happen is they're going to arrest us. You don't see anything, basically without representation. And if you don't like your representation, you get someone new because you're in charge. And she's like, okay. And he's like, which I'm like, did he look up what that was going to happen under these circumstances? Because there was time in between and stuff like that, like his job interview not getting it, and because she's like, oh no, something else will come along, and he's like, no, it's been a week, every job interview has been terrible, so, but so like there was enough of a time, like it didn't clarify it except in some of the dialogue that like a good chunk of time had passed in between certain regards, like it'd been like a couple of days to like a week and stuff like that, so we don't know the full time frame before they fully like turned themselves in, like how long that was between Tabitha reporting them to them actually turning themselves in. Because I actually skipped over, because at the beginning we had our introduction where Susan is talking to her representative Douglas, but Douglas is like, no, I haven't. Because she's like having this she sounds like such a nice lady. And I'm wondering, is that just like, I'm sure Olivia Colman is just doing her thing there, but I'm also sure like, because like, I'm not the most well versed in Olivia Colman's work. I think the only thing I've seen of her work is like Fleabag, where she plays a terrible person. But I love her personality because I've seen her in multiple interviews on like the Graham Norton show, and I'm like, I love her personality. She's like I don't know. It's just something about Olivia Colman that I'm just like, I love you. Just I'm not well versed in your work, but I just love you as a human being. That I'm like, yeah. I'm all about it. And but it's just also that thing of like, I'm wondering, was the real Susan just like that too? Because some of that is also, I'm wondering, am I not hitting a brick wall, but like what also adds to it is like, because I think this is supposed to be like stereotypical British. You know, just like, oh, how polite she's being, but it's also like she's an older lady. Like, I'm sure you could probably see something like that happen in America. Like, it's just one of those weird things of like, these circumstances around this you would never, because I'm curious, like, how big of a story this was in the UK. Like, if you are someone that grew up in Europe, or lived in Europe at the time of this, like, how big was this? Was this like all over the news, massive? Would it still be even considered like a big story even to today? Or is it just one of those like relatively small stories? I'm curious. I mean, for it to get the adaptation it's getting, I would like into the TV treatment it's getting, I would assume it was a pretty big enough story, but that's why I'm like, I don't know. That, you know, that might just be like no, it's not. It was never that big of a story, but it's an interesting story that not many people, I mean, especially someone like, it's because it doesn't seem like it's a big enough like story that it would cross the pond, you know, but maybe it is. Maybe it is one of those things of like, maybe there are Americans who are like, oh yeah, you didn't know that story. It's a very interesting story, but I'm like, you know, you don't, I mean, especially if there's something more recent here, because they were like, yeah, they got convicted in like 2014. So it's like, it's not like this is like a super old story. It's like, no, it's still fairly recent story. It's only what, 7 years old? Like, at least them getting convicted was like 7 years old, because you never know with the trial process of like when the trial actually went underway and stuff like that. Tangents and all that aside. But like I was bringing up, like her politeness to him, and he's like, well, don't, you know, this isn't a private conversation until I actually become your actual representative, which I'm on my way to become your representative. She's like, oh, okay, thanks. Like, she was being so sweet and endearing. And like I said, I don't know if that's just like Olivia Colman bringing it out of the character because that's the way the character was written, or it's just because Susan was like that. But that's why I'm like, is that like a stereotypical like how very British of you to be like super polite about it and stuff like that? Which I know like Canadians get the polite stereotype, but I feel like British people kind of have that as well. Probably not to the extreme that like the Canadian stereotype is that like all Canadians are super nice and stuff like that. If anything, like some of this nature of this story, we'd be like, oh, like someone who's British will probably be like, oh, this is a very British like thing to happen in circumstances. It's like laughably British. It's like the very extremist of like, oh, like that's stereotypically British. But like for me, with my, I guess, American like perspective on things, like I would assume like this seems like something you see in Canada. Like this be a stereotypical story about like, oh, some Canadians were under these very same circumstances. That's where the parallel would be in my head. But once again, tangents and all that aside, I skipped over it too because I love that awkward situation of like, once again, like that's just it. The show is awkward. You even had that moment of like Lacing was in the like passenger seat, and then Collier was like, no, get in the back. She's like, I'm not going to sit in the back, and she has to get in the back, and they have to take off like the child lock, which I'm like, man, I remember those from growing up. Just because one of my parents' vehicles had like a child lock, you'd always have to have someone open the door for you from the outside, because it'd always be something you'd have to flip or something. Like somebody's truck always had like a child lock type of thing going on. It's tangents and all that. So I find it fascinating. It just takes me back to that. But they had that whole conversation about the egg, and then I love Collier's like, what'd you say, Emma? And she's like, what? He's like, yeah, about the whole like, you know, it's like, oh, like what chicken laid that? And she's almost like, what do you, what? It's just like an awkward ride, and it's just like, I'm like, what a weird scene. But like I said, like the Edwards just like casually turning themselves in and like, oh, saying like hi, and we end the episode there. So an interesting start to this. Like I said, I had some notions of what to expect, but it still kind of caught me by surprise. Like, because I brought up earlier, like when I watched the trailer, I was like, oh, some of the lines from Olivia Colman, I'm like, I don't know if that was just like a little bit of funny, but it's like, no, it seems like they're going to lean into like the funny and absurdity. Not all the way, but I think they are just going to like dial it up a little bit with the absurdity of it, but they might also, that might also be, like I said, because there might, like, some of the conversations we'll see throughout this will probably be straight from the actual case itself, once, you know, them also having their own leeway with it. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see where all of this takes us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I'm going to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.